My name's Evan Turiano, and I'm a PhD candidate in history at the Graduate Center, a writing fellow at LaGuardia Community College, and an adjunct lecturer in history at Queens College. The last several months have seen a flurry of crises. These include, of course, the pandemic, a national reckoning with racist policing, and an increase in nativist rhetoric and policies. I've been asked to speak here today at the PSC Demands Justice event because I've done some writing in recent months for Jacobin and the Queens Daily Eagle on how each crisis intersects with higher ed and specifically with CUNY. I hope to try to make sense today of what I see as common ground across those crises. First, they all cast a sharp light on how years of austerity have left institutions of higher education like ours woefully unable to withstand external crises. Each shows how, for a long time, problems we face in education have been framed as innovation problems, or growth problems, or personnel problems, when in reality what we've had for a long time is a drastic, unjust funding problem. And each crisis shows that public, well-funded, equitable education can and should be a lifeline for the most vulnerable in our community, and that when our institutions are at risk, so are they. First, the pandemic. Since May, Governor Cuomo has shown a willingness to cozy up to the ed tech industry, who seek to take advantage of the crisis as a market opportunity in the education sector. For decades, corporate education reformers have argued that American schools don't have a resource problem, but an innovation problem. They need to be disrupted using technology, charter schools, and other privatization schemes. Silicon Valley has been happy to oblige, jumping into the mix and arguing that private sector innovation and digital technology can fix American schools without raising taxes. As of February, even before the bulk of school closures, the edtech industry was projected to pull in more than $250 billion this year. Cuomo's new education czar, Bill Gates, is a big player here. One of his largest education grants in the last decade was more than $85 million in 2011 that was used to launch a service called In Bloom. The idea behind In Bloom was that schools would pool student data that private developers could then use to build apps and technology, which then they would sell back to school districts. Within a year, parent groups and education activists across the country, and particularly here in New York City, organized to kill In Bloom. In an October 2012 letter to state officials, a coalition of New York advocate groups called the sharing of student data and its potential use for commercial purposes a, quote, non-consensual disclosure of intimate facts about school children in exchange for promises of untested, unspecified learning tools that may or may not have been created, or if they are, may not improve children educationally. The In Bloom fight shows that under normal conditions, progressive activists stand ready to block private sector incursions into American schooling. But pandemic conditions, Cuomo knows, are not normal. This is where the crisis comes in. It's Naomi Klein's famous formulation of disaster capitalism. Just like the dismantling of New Orleans' public schools in exchange for school vouchers in the wake of Katrina, private sector edtech boosters like Gates hope that the unprecedented challenges we face in the classroom today will lead politicians to give up critical control and oversight to corporations looking for a profit with little or no input from educators. Many of us have already seen what this looks like in the last several months. Massive cuts to teacher budgets while schools pay mightily for invasive proctoring services and pie-in-the-sky tech solutions. In 1982, the famous titan of conservative economics, Milton Friedman, wrote that, quote, only a crisis, actual or perceived, produces real change. The type of change, he said, quote, depends on the ideas that are lying around. Gates's unregulated, privatized vision of American education is practically sitting in Cuomo's lap. It's on us to make sure it's not the only available option. The role that our institutions can and must play in protecting vulnerable communities was made very clear last month, to move on to sort of another crisis of the last couple of months, when the Trump administration issued an ICE directive stating that international students in the United States would be deported if their colleges remained online because of the COVID-19 pandemic. ICE, of course, rescinded the new rules in the wake of lawsuits and a groundswell of popular opposition, but the order still proved a powerful point. For a moment, schools were forced to choose between risking the lives of their students, faculties, and communities, and losing their international students. These students, Trump proved beyond a reasonable doubt, could be used as political pawns. How did international students end up in this situation as bargaining chips, not just as individuals, but as moneymakers vital to the survival of American universities? Once again, surprise, surprise, it's a story of austerity. Between 1996 and 2012, state funding dropped for public colleges by about 10%. The Great Recession gave states an opportunity to turbocharge austerity. Lawmakers imposed cuts and then simply never reversed them. Funding currently sits about $9 billion below its pre-recession levels. In search of new revenue streams, colleges met a neoliberal problem, austerity, with a neoliberal solution, which is corporate globalization. As state spending fell, international tuition dollars at public universities jumped up by about 12%. Tuition from international students now makes up a full 28% of public university revenue, 40% more than it did just a decade ago. Since 2008, many colleges have settled into this happy, if tentative, new normal of relying on international student tuition dollars to keep the lights on. State funding never recovered, faculty hiring remained stagnant, but revenue grew on the backs of international students. But, like other parts of the neoliberal status quo, Trump's election shook this sort of financial tuition scheme to its foundations. With the International Students Directive, Trump found an opportunity to lash out in several directions at once. Excluding foreign students from American university played into his nativist brand and into the American rights, in particular, anti-Chinese sentiment. Dealing colleges a crushing blow allowed Trump to get back at the liberal elite academics that are an object of his ire, and pushing colleges into dangerous reopenings in the name of their own survival would enable him to advance his goal of restoring some sense of normalcy ahead of the November elections. International students, of course, would have bore the brunt of Trump's order. On the university side, smaller local public colleges in particular would have faced financial ruin for many of these schools. An online semester without international student revenue would have meant an imminent closure. International students in colleges, maybe for now in those senses, can breathe a sigh of relief, but both were susceptible for the same simple reason, which is the privatization of public universities. If our institutions could rely on a stable and robust stream of state funding, we would have been better positioned to serve our students and to shield them from powerful political demagogues. Finally, CUNY's summer of struggle and the cuts that precipitated it have come in the context of a reckoning in this city and all over the country over policing, white supremacy, and fundamentally, who American democracy is for. Our drastic cuts have been met with what is at this point a familiar refrain. We hear that the budget doesn't exist, that cuts are the only way out of the crisis. That is, of course, the politics of cuts and of financial austerity at work. CUNY's leadership has so thoroughly accepted the inevitability of its own financial starvation that it began announcing staff cuts before anyone even saw a state budget. This is, put wisely by Ben Lerner of Brooklyn College, a university so beaten down by, quote, the backward logic of austerity that it responds to crises by attacking itself. I, and presumably all of you, know that cuts are not the only way out. But even if we believe that for a moment, doing so quickly became impossible when we watched this summer the NYPD roll out its weapons of war. New Yorkers protesting the murder of George Floyd by a Minneapolis cop have been met by consistent, swift, and brutal force of law enforcement. The entirety of NYPD's force, over 50,000 officers, was deployed in 12-hour shifts, which the force described as, quote, a wartime measure. Anyone who has experienced New York City austerity politics will notice a few things about the police in viral videos of their violence against protesters that we all have seen. They appear with weapons and protective gear that resemble a military more than a municipal police force. Behind the scenes, we know that unprecedented surveillance and facial recognition technology guide NYPD decision-making. These are the fruits of a $6 billion law enforcement budget that has, between 2013 and last year, increased by a full $1 billion. These sorts of videos are incredible to contrast against images of nurses using trash bags as personal protective equipment, or against the experiences of anyone affiliated with CUNY. If we didn't already know it, this summer has made it clear that New York City public services do not need to starve. The fact that they do is a damning indictment of who our leaders think the city belongs to. The wealthiest New Yorkers who do not send their children to our public schools or colleges, do not ride our public transit, and do not avail of our social safety net have fought since the Giuliani years to orient city services towards the preservation of law and order and the protection of private property. Now the products of that unequal spending are being wielded against working class New Yorkers that have been failed by public spending in almost every respect. This is an injustice that makes the present powder keg feel almost inevitable. This is, however, I think, not a story without hope. The city can be made to work for the majority of New Yorkers, and public pressure has and can continue to force leaders to redirect funds away from policing and towards schools. Teacher strikes across the nation over the last several years have reasserted worker power in our sector and won meaningful gains. Teachers, I think, fight aside a left that is bigger and perhaps more organized than it's been in 2 generations. We need to use that power to push a democratic vision of public education in our institution, in our city, and beyond. Privatization and market-friendly disruptions aren't the only responses to this crisis. So this is, in some ways we're in the middle, or maybe even, the beginning of a long asymmetric fight in which meaningful redistribution remains somewhat unlikely. But we must not forget, and I do think in some ways the summer has shown, that the resources that CUNY needs do exist, and that leaders remain answerable to constituents if loud voices can drown out deep pockets. Thanks to the PSC for putting on this event, and solidarity as we carry on in the fight.